The UFC's heavyweight division is supposed to have the biggest, baddest fights in MMA, but over the last 3+ years, it's pretty much been an absolute shambles. And I think right now, the day that I'm recording this, it feels like we have reached a new low in an already down period for the weight class. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the current issues, how we got here, and then what can be done to fix it. So let's start off by talking about the present day division and why I think it is a disaster. So the current heavyweight weight class has a champion in Jon Jones who hasn't and does not want to fight the interim champion. The whole point of having an interim champ is that they then get the next shot at the current champ. The interim champ, Tom Aspinall, has actually had to defend his interim title and is now just sitting around waiting for Jon Jones to accept a fight. And we have no idea if this fight's actually going to happen. Could Jon Jones take it? Sure. It's also possible he vacates or just ends up retiring and kind of just leaving Tom Aspinall there without the opportunity to unify them. Also, just outside of like the championship issue, the weight class is just very, very thin. I think when you look at the current top 15, in my opinion, there are like 7 real title contenders. And I mean, some of them might be thrown in here kind of loosely. So the guys that I feel like have at least a chance of getting to the belt or getting a title shot: Jon Jones, obviously; Tom Aspinall, obviously; Cyril Gane, Volkov, Pavlovich, Blades, Almeida. I think, maybe Pavlovich hasn't looked great in his last 3. Blades has kind of fallen when he's gotten that elite competition. But I think these are the guys that have the ability to get to the belt. And honestly, at heavyweight, if you're just getting a shot at the title, any of these dudes could land one punch and end up being the new champion. But that's not great, right? And it's not like you have these prospects that are kind of rising up the ranks. It kind of just feels like this is what we're looking at here for at least the next couple of years. The UFC, after the Saudi Arabia Fight Night card, actually went out and released Jairzinho Rozenstruik. And I'm not going to make the argument that he had an amazing fight against Pavlovich and that he looked amazing. But this is a guy who is 9-6 in the UFC. 11 of his 15 fights have ended by finish. And he's going to get released as like a top 10 or borderline top 10 heavyweight because he had one boring matchup. To me, that's crazy. And with the release of Jairzinho, you had 2 guys enter the top 15, Dontel Mays and Jonta Deniz. These guys are both coming in off of L's. They have lost their last fight, and they are now entering the rankings. So you cannot convince me that cutting Jairzinho Rozenstruik does anything positive for the heavyweight weight class. And then even the guys who aren't contenders. So, you don't need to be competing for a belt or championship caliber to be a fun fighter. The non-contenders just aren't super exciting either. Now, if you had a bunch of heavyweights who were a little bit overweight, just throwing bombs, like glass cannons, KO or BKO'd, that would be fine. I think most people would be cool with that. But the non-contenders, like number 7 through 15, they're kind of filled with grapplers, or even the strikers are kind of guys going to decision at heavyweight, which is not great. So let's kind of take a look at where these issues stem from. I think they kind of dates back to the Francis Ngannou-Stipe Miocic fight. Pretty much right after that fight took place, I think things started going downhill. At that time, you had Francis Ngannou, who I think had, insane star potential. He's a super exciting fighter, super dangerous. You could not miss a Francis Ngannou heavyweight fight because you just knew you were going to see a massive knockout. He had just beaten the heavyweight GOAT. And I mean, you look at his story, he is so marketable. Everything he's overcome in his life, Francis Ngannou was like the dream heavyweight champion to have. The next big fight at that point, and it was talked about, Francis was asked about it in his post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. Jon Jones was tweeting about it. The fight to make then was Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. The UFC not making the big fights in the last few years at heavyweight is going to be like a big story of this current time period in the division. And so the UFC just didn't pay Jon Jones enough. They were not willing to, open their checkbook and give him what he wanted or what he thought he deserved. I mean, Dana White even laughed at the fact that Jon Jones wanted Deontay Wilder money. What is so crazy about the champion, someone that Dana has called the GOAT, wanting to get paid like a heavyweight boxing champion? I don't see what's so funny about it, and I don't really see why that's a delusional opinion coming out of Jon Jones. But clearly, Dana White was not willing to pay up. The UFC was not willing to pay up. Then they end up pissing off Francis Ngannou with a BS interim title between Cyril Gane and Derek Lewis. And then once Francis Ngannou's already pissed and pretty much out the door, then all of a sudden they are willing to come to terms with Jon Jones. So they were stubborn in paying Jones. They were stubborn in how they dealt with Francis Ngannou. They had lowballed him. They had pissed him off with the interim title fight. And, he had wanted to explore boxing. They weren't willing to be lenient with his contract. They did not want to, let him go off and have a one-off boxing match. So then we never got to see that fight. And then the UFC shifted their focus on pretty much a pointless Jon Jones-Stipe fight after Jon Jones came in and beat Ciryl Gane for the vacant belt. So overall, I think there's been a lot of mismanagement when it comes to those top guys. And then some of the other issues I talked about, like the depth, how it's kind of thin, that's kind of just how divisions go. Depth comes and goes. They're kind of in a recession right now. Not necessarily the UFC's fault, but they've also just been lucky with like some boring fights, like some most recent ones over the last couple of years. Even the, one on UFC Saudi Arabia, Sergey Pavlovich, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, like that fight should not go to decision. It's two strikers, two guys with knockout power. Seems like 9 out of 10 times that's going to be a knockout. Also, the Sergey Pavlovich-Volkov fight, I think that's one you would assume would be a finish. Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Tai Tuivasa, once again, two strikers, should probably be a knockout. And then Ciryl Gane Volkov, right? Like I think they both kind of clipped each other. All those fights should not be going to decision in like a fairly short period of time when we're talking about like fights towards the higher level of the heavyweight weight class. I also think during this time period, even though the depth, I'm not blaming all on the UFC, I think they have burned through title-worthy challengers. And something that you don't want is that if you have a division that does not have a ton of depth and you only have like 6, 7 real title challengers, and you don't have like another wave of guys coming up, you don't want to be burning these potential matchups that could be, potential title fights if things were managed properly. So you had the first time when Jon Jones-Stipe was first booked, I think at that point, you can make a very strong case that both Sergey Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall were deserving of title shots. Pavlovich had 5 straight round 1 knockouts, and instead he is in an interim title fight against Tom Aspinall. So they kind of burn the title shot for Pavlovich. Aspinall wins the interim. Then he has to defend it against Blades. Not saying, Curtis Blades was overly deserving of like an undisputed title shot, but still someone who had, pretty much built their way up for a title opportunity. I think Alexander Volkov had earned a title shot after the Sergey Pavlovich win. Then he has to fight Ciryl Gane because the division is so backed up, and he's probably like a year away from getting a potential title fight, and that's if Jon Jones fights Tom Aspinall. And then he ends up losing a BS decision to Ciryl Gane, and now both of them are in weird spots because no one really thinks Ciryl Gane won his last fight, and Volkov, on the official record, is coming off an L, even though he probably should have won. But now let's focus on how I think this division can be fixed, how I think the UFC should turn this thing around. Number one, and most importantly, the UFC needs to make this Jon Jones-Tom Aspinall fight. First off, it is just a massive matchup. It is probably a top 2 fight I want to see right now. I think if I could make any fights, the first one would be Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria. Number 2 would be Jon Jones defending the belt against Tom Aspinall. There seems to be like this weird subset of MMA fans, maybe it's just the vocal minority, who believe that like Tom Aspinall is somehow unworthy of fighting Jon Jones. I mean, it's dumb for a variety of reasons, but Tom Aspinall has done more than enough to earn a title shot. He's 8-1 in the UFC. His only loss was a knee injury, 8 finishes, 7 knockouts, 7 finishes in round 1, and he has 5 wins in the top 10. I mean, he might be like the most deserving contender of all time at this point to fight for undisputed. And I think the biggest piece here is you cannot have Jon Jones retire without fighting Tom. If Jon Jones fights Tom Aspinall and wins and then retires, it leaves the division in a bad spot, but at least you kind of got to see what you had. You at least gave Tom Aspinall the opportunity to kind of extend the life of this weight class. But if you have 2 champions, and not just random champions, but like 2 well-respected guys with great resumes, 2 of those champions in the last 4 years both vacate, like that is disastrous to the health of a weight class. It completely ruins the credibility of the division, especially for the less hardcore fans. Like if you're really locked in, Tom Aspinall is an elite fighter. He would be a very, very good champion if Jon Jones was not in the picture. I think he'd be the favorite to beat Jon Jones. I think he has a pretty good shot against Francis. Like these are competitive fights, but Tom Aspinall is 100% championship caliber. But you're going to have that subset of the fan base where Jon Jones retires and it's, oh, Tom's only the champion, because John Jones retired and, left the belt and now he won. And you just don't want that for a weight class that already has other issues. So that's my main point. You got to get this fight to happen. Even if you have to overpay in your mind, if you're the UFC and you think John Jones isn't worth 30 million, it's not just this one fight. It's not what you're going to get, from this one matchup. It's pretty much saving the integrity of the division for at least the next few years here, because I do think it would be disastrous if John Jones just left with the belt. It would just be very rough. My number 2 take here for the UFC is I think they need to be aggressive in free agency. I think the UFC has become very complacent in using the contender series, not willing to pay up for these guys that are top prospects, guys that have some juice, some fan base coming into the UFC. And it's just leading to kind of very thin talent pools in some weight classes. Like, they are only adding heavyweights through the contender series, and it's just straight up like not the cream of the crop. From what I've seen, the only big hit they've had in the contender series was Jailton Almeida, and it even seems like they're frustrated with him at times just based on his style. So if he's like your only hit from the contender series, you might need to reevaluate, look elsewhere, go out and actually sign an established heavyweight. A guy like Vadim Nemkov is a free agent right now. There is zero reason for the UFC to not bring him in, even if I think he'd be better off at 205. Both weight classes are pretty thin. Like, they should be willing to go out and sign these guys. You can't be too prideful to bolster the division and say, oh, we only bring in people on 12 and 12 contracts. It just doesn't make sense. It's not going to help the depth of your weight classes. And I think, Nemkov is the best non-Ngannou heavyweight outside the UFC. And it's kind of an indictment on the UFC here that the PFL has been able to find and sign more interesting heavyweights. I'm not saying the PFL has got a ton of dudes who are like UFC championship caliber, but in like the PFL season, the guys who are kind of in the mix to fight Francis, like, there are guys who could 100% filter into like the number 7 through 15 spots in the rankings. And I think guys that would have more exciting fight styles. Like, when you look at their heavyweight season fights, there's a lot of knockouts. It's not a whole lot of like grind out decisions, guys with no power. So there are some dudes out there where you could improve the depth of the weight class at least a little bit. And then my third point here, I think there could definitely be better matchmaking in the heavyweight division. It's not going to improve the talent, but it could definitely make it more palatable for the fans to watch. And I think the biggest maybe like disconnect between how the UFC views heavyweight and how I view heavyweight is I just don't think you can compare it to other weight classes. There is such an extreme drop off from like, I think the top 7 to like the guys that are ranked 10 through 15. Like, compared to another weight class, I feel like the difference is almost like the top 7 lightweights compared to like guys making their UFC debut in the division and like guys who aren't really going anywhere. It's just how it goes at heavyweight. Like, there's just very little depth, and some of these dudes, they just don't have the athleticism to even touch some of these guys. They're just going to get ragdolled by some of the wrestlers, Curtis Blades, Jailton Almeida. There's just such a disconnect. So I think there should be like 3 groupings in how the UFC views these heavyweights. You have the contenders, which would be those top 7 that I keep referencing. You have the strikers, and then you have like the grapplers / the grinders. So you fight the contenders against each other. Doesn't matter if they're strikers or grapplers. Like, Jailton Almeida can fight Cyril Gane. Those are matchups that can happen. You take the non-contender strikers, they can fight each other. Derek Lewis, Jorginho Rosenstruck, Tai Tuivasa, Cortez Acosta, Mick Parkin, Jonathan Denise, like these guys in the top 15, they should be matched up against each other in striking matchups. I mean, the fact that we never got to see Derek Lewis take on Jorginho Rosenstruck is just a major indictment on the UFC matchmaking here. Like, why is Rosenstruck getting matched up against a Curtis Blades instead of a Derek Lewis? Like, why is Lewis getting wrestled by Sergey Spivak instead of fighting Jorginho Rosenstruck? It just doesn't make sense. No one wants to see it. And then you book the grapplers against each other. I know we've already seen it, but just like an example, Sergey Spivak should be fighting a guy like Marcin Tybura instead of ragdolling Derek Lewis and Tai Tuivasa, because straight up no one wants to see it. And then if you're in one of those like non-contender groups and you're like racking up a ton of wins, then you can get your shot into like the contender group. But for the most part, they should be pretty separated. So this is how I think you bring the heavyweight division back to life. The biggest piece is obviously the John Jones, Tom Aspinall fight. Like, if that doesn't happen, it's going to be probably a few years of darkness in that weight class, but I think there are ways to improve it, even if that fight doesn't come to fruition. Don't be too proud to hit free agency. Sharpen up the matchmaking, and hopefully we see this stuff happen. So let me know your thoughts. How do you think the UFC can turn around heavyweight? Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.